Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching Today and I Found Out, and in the video today we're looking at how Switzerland managed to stay neutral during World War I and World War II. Just before we get started, I do want to say that this video is brought to you by the Great Courses Plus, an on-demand video learning service that's got lectures from top Ivy League professors, as well as experts from other places like the Smithsonian, National Geographic, etc. It's like a university education but at your own pace with no tests or schedules or anything like that. It's also incredibly easy to access, PC, tablet, phone. Get a free trial by going to thegreatcoursesplus.com/brainfood. More about the Great Courses Plus a little later in this video. Well, the tiny mountainous country of Switzerland has been in a state of perpetual neutrality since the major European powers of the time declared it so during the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So, well, why did these countries do this? Okay, so the French conquered Switzerland in 1798 and established the Helvetic Republic. This was in an attempt to make Switzerland something of a strategically positioned French satellite state. Well, not long after that, the Austrian and French forces invaded the country in their war against France. The Swiss, rather than fighting alongside their French overlords, largely refused to. This ultimately led to the Act of Mediation, giving the Swiss back much of their former independence. 12 years later, they got the rest back thanks to that aforementioned Congress of Vienna, in which their neutrality in the wars of their neighbors was officially recognized. Beyond the Swiss themselves having long tried to stay out of the conflicts of Europe since the early 16th century after a devastating loss at the Battle of Marignano, part of the reason Switzerland was granted neutrality in perpetuity in 1815 is because the European powers of the time deemed that the country was ideally located to function as a valuable buffer zone between France and Austria. Thus, granting their neutrality in wars, so long as they continued to stay out of them, would contribute to stability in the region. Since that time, with a few minor exceptions, Switzerland has steadfastly refused to compromise its neutrality for any reason, though on the war front they did suffer an exceptionally brief civil war in the mid-19th century, resulting in only a handful of casualties. While minor in its scale, this civil war actually drastically changed the political landscape of the Swiss government, including the establishment of a constitution partially borrowing from the less than a century old United States Constitution. In any event, as for those aforementioned minor exceptions, Switzerland has occasionally taken part in some global peacekeeping missions, and prior to 1860, Swiss troops did sometimes take part in various skirmishes despite their neutrality. In more modern times, Switzerland needed to defend its borders from both Allied and Axis air incursions during World War II. For instance, they shot down nearly a dozen German planes in the spring of 1940 alone, as well as shot down some American bombers and forced down countless others on both sides. This included grounding and detaining the crews of over 100 Allied bombers that had tried to fly over the country. When Hitler tried to counter Swiss measures at keeping the Luftwaffe from their skies by sending a sabotage team to destroy Swiss airfields, the Swiss successfully captured the saboteurs before they could carry out any bombings. You might think it a bit silly for the Swiss to risk war with both sides by shooting down or forcing down foreign aircraft from their skies, but on several occasions Allied bombers accidentally attacked Swiss cities, mistaking them for German ones. For instance, on April 1st, 1944, this very thing happened and it killed 40 Swiss citizens and destroyed over 50 buildings. This was not an isolated incident. So how exactly did Switzerland, surrounded on all sides by Axis and Allied powers during the war to end all wars, manage to keep enemy troops at bay without much in the way of any fighting? So officially, Switzerland maintains a policy of aggressive neutrality. This means that while it avoids taking part in any conflicts, as evidenced by their Air Force activities during World War II, it will defend its own interests with vigor. So how vigorously? Well, to ensure other countries respect its neutral stance, Switzerland has long put itself into a terrifyingly overprepared position to fight. It's also made sure that every country around them is well aware of this. As for specifics, well, to begin with, a common misconception about Switzerland is that because it doesn't actively take part in global military conflicts, that it doesn't have a strong or well-prepared military. The reality is the Swiss military is a highly trained and competent fighting force, and due to the country's policy of compulsory conscription of males — today women may volunteer for any position in the military but are not required to serve — it is surprisingly large for a country of only 8 million people. In fact, approximately 2/3 of all males are ultimately deemed mentally and physically fit enough to serve in the Swiss military. This means that a huge percentage of their population is trained. Those who are not and aren't exempt because of a disability are required to pay additional taxes until they are 30 to make up for not serving. As for what fighting force is actively maintained, the Swiss military today is only around 140,000 men strong, and just recently it has been voted to reduce that to 100,000. This is a major downsize from just 2 decades ago, when it was estimated the Swiss military had some 750,000 soldiers. For reference, this latter total is about half the size of the United States military today, despite Switzerland only having 8 million people versus the United States' 300 million. Further, Switzerland has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world, and many Swiss people are highly competent in handling firearms due to both compulsory military service and a strong culture of recreational shooting. 500,000 Swiss children are said to be a part of a gun club of some kind. That said, in recent years, the rate of gun ownership has declined somewhat after a series of gun-related incidents, such as one where a man shot his estranged wife with his old military-issued rifle. Prior to that shooting, military conscripts would take home their rifle after their service period ended and were expected to keep it ready for use in defending the country should the need arise. After these incidents, the military curbed this and implemented a new policy stating that any conscript wishing to keep their gun after service must buy it and apply for a permit. As part of this new policy, the Swiss military also no longer provides ammunition with the guns, instead keeping it in secure locations that citizens must get to in the event of an emergency. And speaking of emergencies, generally speaking, Switzerland is prepared for nearly any global catastrophe, whether that's nuclear fallout or a surprise invasion. This is because of a defensive plan that they've had in place since 1880. This defensive plan was also doubled down upon in World War II and later during the Cold War. Dubbed the Swiss National Redoubt, Switzerland has taken advantage of its unique natural geography, which includes mountains that surround it on nearly all sides, to build countless bunkers, fortifications, and warehouses across the country that can be accessed at a moment's notice. The full scale of the fortifications is a closely guarded secret, but some of them are kept in plain view as part of a comprehensive campaign of deterrence. Initially, the National Redoubt consisted of tunnels bored into the many mountains of Switzerland in key strategic positions for retreating troops and citizens to take shelter in, but over the years these have evolved to encompass a host of ingenious defensive and offensive structures. Along with tunnels and bunkers, which are fully stocked and contain everything from bakeries and hospitals to dormitories, the mountains of Switzerland also hide countless tanks, aircraft, and hidden artillery guns, some of which are pointed directly at Switzerland's own roads to destroy them in the event of an invasion. Oddly, for a landlocked country, Switzerland does maintain an active navy of sorts, though they don't store any boats in its mountains, as far as we could find. The naval branch of the Swiss forces' primary role is patrolling the country's lakes on the border and providing aid in search and rescue operations. Okay, so as for more specifically how they kept themselves out of the world wars, during World War I, the Swiss military, under freshly appointed General Ulrich Willow, mobilized well over 200,000 Swiss soldiers and deployed them across its major entry points to deter any outside forces from considering waging war on the country. After it became apparent that Switzerland's neutrality would be recognized by all powers in the First Great War, the vast majority of the Swiss troops were sent home. In fact, in the final year of the war, the Swiss military had shrunk its numbers to just 12,000. Simply, nothing further was required to keep the Swiss out of World War I. World War II was a different beast altogether, with Switzerland not banking on Hitler respecting their long-held neutral stance in European conflicts. Thus, newly appointed Swiss General Henri Guesson was given the unenviable task of trying to figure out a way to defend the small country from their neighbors, Hitler and his allies, despite the fact said powers drastically outmatched the Swiss army in a variety of ways. Towards this end, leading up to the war, the Swiss withdrew from the League of Nations to help ensure their neutrality and began to rebuild their military, bringing the number up to 430,000 combat troops within 3 days of the start of the war. They also strongly encouraged their citizens to keep at minimum 2 months' worth of supplies on hand at any given time. On top of that, they also began secret negotiations with France to join forces against Germany should Germany attack Switzerland, which was a risky move that was discovered by the Germans after France fell fell to them. But even with all that, knowing the Swiss couldn't win if Hitler really wanted to invade, Guisan and co. made the decision to drastically ramp up their World War I era strategy of making invading Switzerland as unsavory an option as possible. Guisan noted that by utilizing Switzerland's harsh terrain, a comparatively small amount of Swiss soldiers in a secure defensive position could fight off a massive fighting force if the need ever arose. So the plan was essentially to perpetually defend and retreat to some fortified position over and over again, ultimately conceding the less defensible populated areas of the country once the government and citizens had managed a retreat into secret fortified positions in the Alps. They would then use the Alps as a base from which to launch guerrilla attacks to make life as miserable as possible for any successful invasion force. More controversially, Switzerland continued to trade with Nazi Germany during the war in order to further disincentivize Hitler from invading. There is some speculation that some of the Allies' claimed accidental attacks on Switzerland were really not accidents at all, given that some of the buildings that were blown up were factories supplying the Axis powers. Well, this multi-pronged plan, it totally worked, and while Hitler did have a detailed plan in place of how to invade Switzerland, the cost of doing so was always too high given the problems that the Axis powers were having on both the eastern and western fronts. Thus, Switzerland was largely ignored by both Allies and the Axis powers during World War II, despite its amazingly well-placed location right next to Germany, Italy, France, and Austria. Switzerland stepped up their level of defense during the Cold War, again mostly out of a desire to deter any potential invaders. This time, however, the focus was on aggressively defending Switzerland's borders instead of defending them only long enough to cover a retreat into the well-fortified mountains. Towards this end, Switzerland's roads, bridges, and train lines were rigged with explosives that could be detonated at any time. In many cases, the engineers who designed the bridges were required to come up with the most efficient way using explosives to ensure the complete destruction of those same bridges. Once the destruction plan was developed, hidden explosives were installed at the appropriate locations on the bridges. On top of that, the military also lined hundreds of mountains flanking major roads with explosives in order to create artificial rock slides. All total, over 3,000 points of demolition are publicly known to have been implemented throughout the small country. With ground attacks covered, the Swiss, they looked to the skies. Unfortunately for them, attack by air is much harder to defend against for a country so small that enemy air forces could penetrate anywhere within its borders before an adequate defense could be mustered to defend its cities. To protect against this, the Swiss government constructed thousands of bomb shelters in homes, towns, and cities to such a degree that it's estimated that anywhere between 80 to 120% of the country's population could hide in them for extended periods. Many of these shelters also included small hospitals and the necessary equipment to set up independent command centers. In fact, homes built after World War II were often made with over 40 centimeter, that's 16-inch thick concrete ceilings to help them survive aerial bombings. If your home didn't accommodate such a shelter, you had to pay a tax to support the places that did. It's also rumored that much of Switzerland's gold supply, as well as vast supplies of food stores, have been similarly squirreled away somewhere in the Alps, which comprise just over half of the country's total land area. As a further example of just how ridiculously well prepared the Swiss are for any and all threats, there are things like hidden hydroelectric dams built inside of unmarked mountains, so that in the event of mass bombings, they'd still have electricity from these secret facilities. And remember, these are the things the Swiss government lets the general public know about. It's thought that there are probably more fortifications and hidden goodies scattered throughout the country's landscape. Since the end of the Cold War, similar to how the Swiss government has been slowly disarming its population and reducing its standing army, decommissioning some of these fortifications has begun in order to reduce government spending. The Swiss government is somewhat coy about the extent of this disarming, but it has been reported that many of the more extreme defenses, such as the explosives that used to be hidden inside the country's bridges and along its road and railways, have been removed. As for the bunkers, unfortunately, simply abandoning many of these facilities is not an option, and it's fairly expensive to decommission them. As such, as the head of security policy for the Federal Department of Defense, Christian Katrina, said, "In most cases, we'd be glad if someone would take them off our hands for no price." In some cases, this has resulted in companies using the ridiculously well-protected and secure mountain facilities as data repositories and server farms. In one such converted bunker, the servers inside are even completely protected from outside electromagnetic impulses that might result from nuclear explosions. In another, detailed instructions on how to build devices for reading all known data storage formats, even older formats like floppy disks, are kept so that if that knowledge knowledge is otherwise lost, future generations can still decode our data storage devices to access the data within correctly. Essentially, the researchers involved in this particular project have attempted to create a Rosetta Stone of data formats and are using a ridiculously secure Swiss bunker as the storage point for that knowledge. As a result of military downsizing, the fate of the rest of the fortifications is unclear, and there are calls to decommission all of them, despite the estimated billion-dollar price tag of doing so. There is even a growing minority of the Swiss population who would like to see the entire military disbanded, including ceasing military conscription. But for now, at least, any country that wishes to ignore Switzerland's long-held neutrality in military conflicts will find the tiny country an exceptionally difficult one to conquer and occupy. And presumably, if war ever again threatens Switzerland's borders, regardless of how small they make their military today, they'll likely keep themselves in a position to rapidly ramp back up their defenses, as they did for both World War I and World War II. So just before we get into today's bonus facts, I do want to tell you a bit about the Great Courses Plus. Look, if you are watching this video, the chances are that you probably like learning, and there's no better place on the internet to take a course into something you're interested in than the Great Courses Plus. And even if right now you can't think of anything that you'd particularly like to go and learn, you are sure to be inspired when you visit the website. Maybe watching this video about Switzerland, you might want to learn more about that time in history, take a course on Hitler's empire or World War II, a military and social history. Loads of great stuff. So at the start of this video, I mentioned that courses, they're taught by top Ivy League professors, as well as experts from other places like the Smithsonian. They've got over 8,000 lectures with everything from history, like I just mentioned, to things like cooking. Just to give you an example of how totally diverse the stuff is, and honestly, I've never watched it, but as an example, they have a course called Birding in North America, made by National Geographic. I didn't even know birding was a real word. Look, it's a university education, but it's at your own pace with no tests or schedules. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can access it on your PC, tablet, phone, wherever. They've also recently added audio streaming, so you can listen and learn on the move, something I particularly love doing. I like jogging, so I just plug in and off I go. And best of all, you can try the Great Courses Plus for free. Just go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/brainfood or click in the description below. Doing that helps support the show, so thank you to the Great Courses Plus for sponsoring, and let's get into those bonus facts. Shortly before World War II, Switzerland passed the Swiss Banking Act, which allowed bank accounts to be created anonymously. This was in no small part to allow German Jews to hide their assets from the Third Reich. And now for another bonus fact. The term Swiss Army knife was coined by United States soldiers after World War II. The soldiers had trouble pronouncing the original name of the device, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it stands for Swiss Officer's Knife, and thus began calling the multi-tool a Swiss Army knife. The company that makes Swiss Army knives is Victorinox, named after the founder Karl Elsner's deceased mother, Victoria. The Nox part comes from the fact that stainless steel is also known as inox, which is short for the French term inoxidable. Karl Elsner himself was originally the owner of a surgical equipment company. He later took over production of the original Model 1890 knives, which were previously made in Germany. He moved the production to Switzerland and greatly improved the design of the original multi-tool. His big breakthrough came when he worked out a way to put blades on both sides of the handle using the same spring to hold both sides in place. This allowed him to put twice as many features into the multi-tool as was previously possible. And now for another bonus fact. On average, more people commit crimes in Switzerland who aren't Swiss citizens than who are every year, which has very recently led to harsher deportation laws. In fact, of the top 25 nationalities to commit crimes in Switzerland, 21 of them commit more crimes than the Swiss while on Swiss soil. Indeed, on average, immigrants are more than 390% more likely to commit crime than Swiss citizens. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, thanks to our patrons on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting us with a small and voluntary financial contribution, please do consider heading over to patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut. And as always, thank you for watching.